Good day, folks, and welcome to Not Just Business. Several people have asked me over the last few months when I'm going to talk about negotiation. I've been considering this for some time now, and I've been struggling at what level to pitch it at, and what is it that people really want to know. So I suppose I've decided that the best place to start is at the beginning. That's why I'm calling this episode Negotiation 101. And sadly, most people aren't even there yet. They need to be. So before switching off this podcast and moving to something else, listen on, because I'm sure you'll learn at least one thing you didn't know. I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible, but in order to ensure that I cover what people might want to know and also what I may have forgotten already and not think of mentioning, I've asked my good friend Peter Thomas to ask me some questions. So today we're going to do a sort of a reverse interview. Thanks for doing this, Peter, and welcome.
Pleasure, Derek. Nice to be with you again. Derek, what I find intriguing when you asked me whether I wouldn't interview you is thinking about your history and your career. You were a CEO in the financial services industry. That's a long way removed from a negotiation as a skills development. I mean, you certainly were a very skilled negotiator, but, you have to actually apply your mind to say, what are the principles we're talking about? What made you decide that this was such an important sphere to play in?
Well, yeah, I became interested in negotiation about 30 years ago at least. I mean, more interested. And there's always been a bit of a thrill for me in doing a deal and to do it properly, and to make it beneficial for all sides. Probably at least 30 years ago with a little book called Getting to Yes, Negotiation, or rather Negotiating an Agreement Without Giving In, by William Ury, Roger Stone, and Bruce Patton, I think, with the three authors. Roger Fisher. Yeah, of course. I'm getting my horses mixed up already. But anyway, that book, I think, is the Bible, as far as... And if you're only ever going to read one book on negotiation, that's the one to read. You'll probably be able to do 70% of your negotiations not knowing much else. Obviously, if you read it and apply the principles. So I started applying that at a fairly young age in my career, and I was amazed at some of the results I got, and I was very chuffed. And I've always been interested I've read dozens of books over the years, and then eventually I decided after retirement, a couple of years after retirement, to go to Harvard Law School to the source of all these important texts coming out on negotiation. So I actually went there twice. I did their negotiation and leadership, and I did their advanced masterclass. And I think I was the first South African to do that. But yeah, and it's fascinating, there you get, I suppose it's the equivalent of, if you're a poker player going to play at the World Championships, because there you're really meeting really good players, in this case, really good negotiators, your classmates, and testing yourself against the best. Except, of course, it's not like poker where there's just a win. One side wins. Negotiation is a strange game. Ideally, you should win, but the other side should win too. But it's okay. In fact, your aim should be to win more and still make it worthwhile for them. So yeah, that's where the interest came, and only when I came back that I realized there's a market for this. People don't know this stuff, and they're not very good at it. And corporations throw people in to do negotiations, multi-million rand negotiations that they're not really equipped to do. There's an obvious need for this kind of skill. And that's part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast.
It's quite incredible. The only knowledge I have of negotiation skills is dealing with a trader in either Cairo or in Thailand somewhere.
Yeah.
Who're trying to sell me a piece of cloth.
That's what most people think, that, confuse negotiation and bargaining. And bargaining is when you're fighting over a price and the object is seen as a fixed pie. Whatever you get, I don't get. And that's why it turns into an arm wrestle, and it's not very effective. And of course, there are many ways to make this pie bigger so that your slice is bigger than the previous whole pie, but we'll get to that. So yeah.
Super.
So why it's important, we all negotiate every day, whether we are aware of it or not. So, we negotiate with our spouses, our children, our bosses, our colleagues, suppliers, clients, regulators. Every day we are likely to be negotiating with at least one other party. And unfortunately, as I say, we do not do this very well in general, mainly because we've never been taught.
And I guess that is part of what does happen in life, is that people blunder into these things. So what are the real risks then of not being a good negotiator or being a poor negotiator?
Okay. So, well, I suppose there's a few. If you're not a good negotiator, many things can go wrong and probably will. First thing is you could accept a deal which you should have rejected, meaning that your alternative option is probably more attractive than the deal you went into. Or you could walk away from a deal that you should have accepted, which means that your best alternative course of action is not as attractive as the deal you just walked away from. And then, in negotiation jargon, we talk about you could leave too much money on the table. That means you conclude a deal where there's a better deal to be struck that would have benefited both sides more. And alternatively, you could have taken too much money off the table, which again is negotiation parlance for trying to screw the other party, thereby removing the incentive to perform. For example, you could get quotes for painting your house. Choose the lowest and then want to prove your negotiation skills and then bargain the living daylights out of them. And the result is probably going to be watered down paint and a really shoddy job. That's when you take too much money off the table. So those, I think, are the main risks. There's obviously a further risk is for not tying down the agreement as it should be tied down. The final contract is not very specific or not specific enough, and certainly doesn't tell you what to do when things go wrong. So those are the main risks that I can think of. Yeah.
So just listening to you and hearing how important this is and the fact that we're all negotiating all the time, how does one develop the skills? Are you born with them or can you learn them? I mean, is this a complex process too?
Yeah, people say, they look up to certain figures on TV, typically lawyers with smart suits, and they say, no, that guy's a good negotiator. What they mean is he's a good bargainer. And for most of my lawyer friends will know that they're not, the legal profession is not the best at negotiating, but we'll leave it there. So are good negotiators born? If they think they are, if they think they're good negotiators, they're probably not. But on the other hand, anybody can be taught. If they just practice a few skills, it's not too difficult to learn. There's not a hell of a lot of theory, by the way. And if you apply those things in practice, you can become a good negotiator even if it's not your natural skill set. In fact, a good negotiator, strangely enough, is not necessarily an extrovert. You don't have to be out there. Some of the best negotiators in the world have been serious introverts, quiet, humble people. So this is not the realm of the table-pounding lawyer. I want this and I want that and I want more of this.
Well, Hollywood would have us believe it's the slippery, silver-tongued devil that is the one who gets the main prize.
And you might get a deal, but it's going to collapse around him in a short time. If the other side has no incentive to perform, they will find a way to not perform.
True. In fact, I think that there's a very good example of that in the building industry. We're just busy building an estate manager's office in our estate. And we had a very specific budget that we could spend. And we came in above budget, but as close as we could. The prices, the quotes we got were very varied. And we accepted the lowest one. And of course, what we didn't realize is we try to say, make sure this is a complete deal. The scope creep is horrendous at how we're being taken. Well, it didn't include damp proof. It didn't include this. Didn't include that.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
So there are some huge lessons to be learned in that negotiation.
You get this thing, I'm thinking of your painters now, called, usually in bigger contracts, the average painter won't know this, but the big contracts have things. There's this element called strategic misrepresentation. They know how to draw up contracts, and the big tender companies will know how to draw up contracts that, they'll come in at any price you want them to come, but the rest is in the fine print.
Yes.
And the fine print is usually a few hundred pages, and you'd better make sure that you or your lawyers or both go through it very carefully. Better still, make sure you put your own contract down before they put theirs down. But that's maybe a subject for a more advanced podcast.
But a very good point, which leads, of course, to the challenge that businesses face. I mean, most managers, as you were saying earlier, have to negotiate all the time. I mean, how are they kind of getting through? Are they doing reasonably well or not?
Yeah, well, in general, deals get done, but then, as I say, all sorts of things go wrong because the deal wasn't properly constructed. Or, as I said, money's left on the table or taken off the table. I think it's generally because they haven't been taught. They may even have attended some kind of negotiation course somewhere in their career, but the lessons didn't sink in. They put it in the drawer. They were quite excited the day after the course, but then they just reverted to the old type. So these skills haven't been practiced, and they've confused negotiation with bargaining. As I said, there's this perception of a fixed pie, and they consider their job is to get the biggest slice of that pie possible. Of course, believing that whatever you get, they don't get. So it's a very narrow view of negotiation. So I hope to illustrate this by means of some examples later on. But anyway.
I guess the key question is, it is such a fundamental and important part of any business existence. Why is that happening, Derek? Why isn't somebody actually observing and saying, hey, hold on a sec, we're not doing a good job of this negotiation?
Possibly because, mediocrity has become the norm, or the people that have to evaluate this don't know any more than the people actually doing the job. So one of the things I would recommend to an organization is do a negotiation audit. Get somebody who knows about this stuff, come and see how negotiations are done, what needs to change, what are the practices, what gets in the way of good negotiation practice. But, and that could save a company or make a company millions of dollars. But there is this thing that people who are promoted to certain positions think that, well, I must be a good negotiator, otherwise I wouldn't have got this job. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that goes wrong.
Well, in fact, as I'm hearing you articulate this idea, I kind of think of most organizations I deal with, and they have good salespeople, and those people think they are absolutely natural negotiators. Now, they must be making a lot of the mistakes you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. People often ask me what's the difference between selling and negotiating. People confuse the two, and they actually don't know when they're doing what. So in general, I like to make the distinction between the two. Negotiating, or rather selling, is persuading somebody that they want or need your product or service. Okay? After that, negotiation comes in. Negotiation is agreeing the terms and conditions upon which that product or service will be delivered. So don't start negotiating terms and conditions before you've actually established the person on the other side of the table actually wants your product or service. If there's no indication of this, then you probably haven't convinced him yet, so you haven't finished selling. But, there is a huge overlap in the skill set required for selling on the one hand and negotiation on the other. So just be aware of where you are in the process. So, the selling skills, one can argue, in generally are as poor in general, and very few salespeople actually make their targets. There is a difference between selling and negotiating, but you need a lot of the same skills to do either of them.
Makes a huge amount of sense, which of course leads to the natural question. It says, what are the kind of principles, the key criteria for a good negotiator? What do they really do well?
Well, I think the first thing is they prepare. So good negotiators don't go into any kind of negotiation without sufficient preparation. And that's usually where most sides fall down. And involve with the whole team that's going to be involved in this negotiation, in the preparation, so that they're all on the same page when you actually get there. So now, of course, the level and extent of the preparation required will differ according to the circumstances. For instance, if your 4-year-old son wants to negotiate what time he's going to go to bed, you probably need a bit of preparation, probably more than you think. But not as much, as if you were negotiating a multinational merger, for example. So it depends on the level of negotiation as to how much to prepare. But when you're going into any kind of business negotiation, there's quite a lot that you need to prepare. And, I can quickly run through.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You would ask yourself questions about your side, about their side, and about two sides together. So, for instance, on your side, you would ask, what do you want? What do I want from this negotiation? And that's not as trivial as it sounds. Often we know what we want, but we don't know why we want it. I know before you've asked me about the difference between positions and interests. And that is probably one of the main things that you need to know as a negotiator. People say they want things. You're not only going to know what that is, but you also got to know why they want it. And I use my favorite simple example of Johnny and Mary fighting over an orange in the class. And Johnny says, I want the orange. And Mary says, I saw it first. I want it. Let's just say this orange is of unknown provenance. It was just lying around.
Yeah.
And then eventually the teacher finds him fighting, and she takes the orange and cuts it in half and gives them each a half, and off they go. Now we can understand the teacher in her frustration probably had lots to do, but that's what one calls a compromise. And good negotiators hate compromises, And sometimes managers will pat themselves and each other on the back for reaching a compromise on a deal, where compromise, as far as good negotiators are concerned, are lose-lose solutions. So Johnny wouldn't feel that he'd won half an orange. He would feel that he'd lost half an orange, and Mary likewise. Now, their positions were the same. They both wanted the orange. But if the teacher had bothered to ask a question, she might have got a range of answers. But let's just say that Mary said, well, I want the peels. I'm baking a cake, an orange cake, and I need the peels to decorate the cake. And Johnny might say, but I want to eat the damn orange, man. You can have the peels. The problem solved. They could have both got everything they wanted. Now, that's a win-win solution.
Fantastic.
You see, their positions were the same, but their interests were entirely different. And often the solutions to putting together a deal lies in the differing or overlapping interests, not in the positions. The positions will almost always be contrary. I mean, there could be, that's, it sounds like a fairy tale, that story, but I can guarantee you it almost always is applicable. I mean, it could be something like, Mary might have said, well, my mother packed in guavas for me, 2 guavas, and I hate guavas, Johnny said, I don't mind, give me the guavas, you can have the orange, So that's just another possible solution. Or Johnny could have said, I forgot my lunch, we've got plenty of food at home, but I just didn't bring any, I'm starving. And Mary might have said, the teacher might have asked Mary, when do you need the peels? When are you baking this cake? She might have said, tomorrow. Well, Johnny, is it okay? You take the orange now, but tomorrow you bring Mary an orange and an apple for the trouble. Maybe something for the teacher too. Another problem is solved, So there are many ways, but the point is you don't get there until you've asked questions.
So what you're really saying is you have to actually find out what they're really interested in. So it is that question of asking why.
Yes, exactly.
Why is this important to you?
Absolutely.
When you spell it out like that, it just seems so obvious. Why are they not doing that? Why do people stick to their position?
Because they're not trained to do it. Or I would say it doesn't come naturally. For good negotiators, I suppose it comes naturally.
So that's really what your preparation is about, is saying, if I put myself in the shoes of the person I'm going to negotiate with, what do they really want? What's important to them? Why are they wanting to do this deal? Or why are they even considering this deal? Exactly.
So you've got to ask yourself other questions while you're preparing. For instance, what am I going to do if this deal fails? Getting back to business deals. What am I going to do if we don't reach agreement with the other side? And, the better your no-deal option is, or what they say at Harvard, your BATNA, BATNA, which is an acronym for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, the stronger that is, the more effective you'll be in your negotiation, the more confident you'll be. For instance, if I'm negotiating with you for a job in your company, and I know that I've got alternatives, I haven't approached anybody else yet, but I think I'll be able to get a job with a company next door, then I might feel okay. If I actually have an offer from the company next door in my pocket, I'm much more comfortable negotiating with you, even if I really want to work for you. So having a no-deal option is very important. Otherwise, you're not negotiating. You might just be begging and not negotiating if you don't have alternatives. So, then you ask the same questions of the other side. Why are they negotiating with me? What do I have that they need? And what are their interests, and how important are each of these issues to them? And what are they going to do if we don't reach agreement? And then, you might ask yourself questions about the combined table. So what is our relationship history? So have we got good relationships with them? How might this affect our current talks? And then come up preliminary. Of course, you're going to test all these things because you haven't even started talking to them really yet. You haven't started negotiating with them. Come up with some proposals that might meet both of your interests and their interests as you currently see their interests, of course. And then practice communicating your message,
You mean just do a role play?
Yes, especially preparing for difficult questions, which will always come up, The subject of difficult questions and difficult people and different personality types and different culture types. They consume people's minds when they're talking about negotiation, and actually none of them are very important. There are easy ways to deal with all of them. I don't spend a lot of time on that, but I'm prepared to, if people are interested in that kind of stuff, they can just ask questions on the podcast website. But anyway, so those are the basics of preparation.
Very important. So now you've done your preparation, you're now going into the negotiation. What is the next important principle that we should be applying?
Well, as illustrated with the Johnny and Mary story, I suppose, learn to ask good questions and learn to listen to the answers. So good negotiators practice active listening very well. So, most of your listeners or our listeners will probably have heard of active listening and what it involves. They don't necessarily do it very well, but it's a very important part of, and I'm not going to preach what active listening looks like, except that you've got to ask the right kind of questions and you've got to listen to the answers. And then there's another thing which is very important. In fact, I do exercises to keep myself sharp at this, and that's called noticing, power of noticing. Now, I do, that's another. I hope to interview the person one day who came up with these exercises, but there are actually things that you can do to improve your ability to notice things, And in fact, there's a guy called Max Bazerman who wrote a book called The Power of Noticing. And he's also a Harvard professor. In fact, he's also from the negotiation program. It makes a huge difference if you notice when you think people might be evasive or you think they might be using what we call linguistic viruses. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, but some of those things are, for instance, when people state things as if they're facts, but they're actually just their opinions. Or they hope you believe. And so, you've got to know what kind of questions to ask. When somebody says, for argument's sake, it's going to rain next Friday, talking about 10 days hence. And, that's an assessment because that can't be a fact. He doesn't know it yet. So one was to test what is the basis for him thinking. If he says, if you ask him, why do you think it's going to rain next Friday? And he says, well, I feel it in my bones. Then you know how much credibility to give it. That's what we call an ungrounded assessment. That's just one of the linguistic viruses. If on the other hand he says, I've looked up 3 weather websites and they all say it's going to rain next Friday. Well, okay, it's not yet a fact. We don't know yet, but it's certainly, we're not going to plan for a sunny day next Friday because it certainly looks like it's going to rain. So, and often people put down assessments on the table as if they're facts. And of course, for facts, you should be prepared to provide evidence when asked. So those are the little things, and there's lots of those. They make promises when from what you've heard, you've figured out that they actually can't deliver what they're promising. So that's another kind of linguistic virus. Or they make offers that they can't deliver on, So, yeah.
I suppose body language plays quite a big role as well.
Body language, yeah. One certainly would look for, and since I've been doing these exercises, I've looked on documentaries. For instance, there's one documentary on some guy, it's a long court case, this guy's involved, but to me, it's evident from a very early age that he's guilty. He's guilty as sin because of certain mannerisms and things. But anyway, that's a long story. So that's what good negotiators, they're good listeners, and they're good at coming up with win-win solutions, Just to give you an example, First of all, let me explode a myth. People have often looked down on this Harvard style of negotiation as, win-win, it's weak, You should be more firm and stronger. Win-win does not mean I get half and you get half. Win-win is not 50-50. It doesn't mean we go arm in arm down the road, skipping and jumping and singing Kumbaya. Because my job as a negotiator is to get as much as I can for my side while making it worthwhile for you. You've got to win too. Now, for instance, if I were an attorney, I might plea bargain a deal where my client goes to jail for 6 years instead of 20. So that's a win for me. It's a win for us. It's a win for the state because they don't have to have a trial. And we gain 14 years for my client. But on that first night in prison, he's probably not going to feel like you won. So just the perception that win-win negotiations are somehow inferior to hard bargaining is a myth. Hard bargainers seldom arrive at sustainable deals, and they damage relationships in the process. Whereas your job as a negotiator is to get a good deal for your side as well as enhance the relationship, not destroy it. But to get back to your question, sometimes two parties understand after some discussion what it is that the other side wants, and still they are unable to come up with win-win solutions. So let's go back to Johnny and Mary and the orange of unknown source. So we've already spoken about various solutions depending on the answers to the teacher's questions. But the one thing that we do is, for instance, one of the ways of solving a problem is taking a one-issue thing and adding an issue. Now, let me give you another example. So I'm selling you widgets, and say I'm selling you 1,000 widgets and my price is 10 Rand each. And you say, Derek, can you do it for 9 Rand? And I might say, well, Peter, if you take 2,000 widgets, I can probably give you a nice discount. So there's a couple of things that have happened here. I have added an issue called volume. And there's another two things to note here. I have made the way I've stated that I could give you a discount. I'm asking you for something specifically like double the volume for something relatively vague. If I can give you a discount, I haven't said what that discount is yet. There's a reason for that, but that's also for another podcast. The point is I've added an issue of volume. Another example of an issue I can add is time. For example, if I've given you, or rather, if you've given me a project that I've got a quote on for you, and I've done lots of projects for you before, for argument's sake, but you've noticed that my price is now like 20% higher than I normally charge for the same kind of work. And you say, where does this come from, And I might say, well, after a lot of humming and hawing, actually I have to outsource this job because we're so full at the moment. And therefore, I have to charge a bit extra because I have to supervise the person I've outsourced it to make sure it's of the same quality. And you might say, okay, but so you're busy right now, but I don't need it now. What are you like in 2 months? I might say, well, in 2 months' time, I'm completely open. Then you might say, well, okay, so let's do it in 2 months then. But I don't only want your normal price. I want a little bit of a discount on that too, because I'm filling up your order book for far in advance, So we both win. I'm guaranteed that I've got work in 3 months' time, and you're paying less than you normally do because you don't actually need it now. So, so I've added an issue of time. And there are all other kinds of issues things that you can do, win-win solutions. I mean, contingency contracts, common and a popular one. For instance, that's when we have different assumptions about what the future is going to be like. For instance, I say I'm going to make $1 million profit a year. I'm busy selling my business to you. You look at me and you say, I don't think you're going to make more than 500,000 profit a year. And we can't agree on price because of the differing projections of future profits. Well, you might say, well, let's base it on your 500,000. We'll pay you for 500,000. And if you get more, I'll pay you the difference. Yeah? And if you actually make $1.5 million, I'll pay you more. So you can get some on the upside there. So takes both sides, and that's kind of a win. Contingency contracts are quite common. Although, you have to be wary of what kind of behavior you incentivize.
Absolutely.
If you incentivize short-term profits, you might just get there.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those things you take into account. So those are a few of the ways. There are others, but I just want to say there are tools that people use, that good negotiators use, to quickly come up with win-win solutions when other people might get stuck there and say, okay, what do we do now?
So just reading between the lines and listening to you, Derek, there's got to be a certain skill at when you make an offer, how you make the offer, and how you respond to an offer.
Yeah, that's quite important. Good negotiators, well, there's a definite advantage to making the first offer. Now, bear in mind, when we talk about offer, it could be if it's more than one issue, it's not just price, it could be a proposal on various aspects of the thing we're talking about. But let's assume that, for instance, it's just one issue and it's price, and you make me an offer. And what an offer does, if you make the offer first, it has an anchoring effect. Suddenly, it changes my perception of what's possible. And even experienced negotiators get caught by this thing called anchoring. For example, if my house was on the market for, say, 5 million rands, because I thought that was a fair price and because the estate agent told me that's sort of the market value around here. And the first guy came along and he looked around and he said, I'll give you 3.5. Immediately, it plays with my mind. Oh, my word, where does this come from? Did my estate agent lie to me? Have I totally overestimated the market? It's become, suddenly it anchors my mind. It changes my perception of what's possible. And then there's two things that you don't do when you get a very low offer, ridiculously low offer, is you don't counter offer. And your estate agent will probably say, well, if you don't like the offer, then counter offer, Because, the research shows that the final deal price will be halfway between the first semi-reasonable offer and the first counter offer. So if I counter offer 4.5, we're probably going to end on 4, which might be a lot less than I wanted. And the other thing you don't do when you've been anchored like this was, you don't say, where did you get that number from? I know there's a part of negotiation theory, and you'll read that in Getting to Yes, that people should base their offers on some sort of number. But when you don't ask people to justify their number is when they've got a ridiculous offer, because people will find a way to justify even the crappiest little offer. And the more it's discussed, the more of an anchor it becomes. So you've got to find a way to wipe the offer off the table, before, if somebody comes along with a low offer like that, I would say, well, come on, I think we're on totally different planets here. If you want to be serious, come with a serious offer, but thanks, but no thanks, bye. Yeah, so don't make the first offer if you don't know as much as the other side does of the value of the product or service under discussion. So don't make a blind first offer. That's like really stupid. So try and find out as much as you can about the value of the property or the object or the service under discussion in your talks. And then, as soon as you do know as much as the other side, try and get your first offer in. Try and get your offer in first, rather. So there's an advantage to making a first offer, but don't make it unless you know as much as the other side does. That's the basic rule. When you get an offer that is far better than you expected, there are various responses to that. Some negotiators will counter offer for more. Some will say, well, that's, the last thing you do is high five your colleagues around the table, of course. or in the car park, because, the guy might be watching from his window. But so try and keep a straight face. Say, thanks, that sounds reasonable. Even for that price, we might even throw in this, or, depending on the relationship, of course. Counter offering is the extreme side of, that's the hard side, but it could still be a win-win if it's offered. And then the most important thing is always assume that there's something that you don't know. So if he's offering you an extraordinary amount for a piece of land, you think it's farmland and he knows there's gold under the surface. Just assume there's something that you don't know. So it's always a good practice.
And how do you handle that then, Derek?
Well, there's not much that you can do unless if you like the offer, I suppose you're going to accept it or you're going to counter offer a little bit. But I suppose unknowns will be unknowns until they're known.
But if that very point about if you're negotiating for a piece of ground, you'll only discover afterwards that there's huge additional value because there's gold or whatever underground.
Yeah, I suppose one could put in contingencies like that, but if there's a prospect of it, if there's no reasonable prospect of there being something under the ground, then one wouldn't go into that trouble. If it's buying it in the middle of town to build a shopping center rather than next to another gold mine somewhere, your expectations would be different.
Well, I suppose if you're in that negotiation, you're actually looking for a sale anyway. So you probably if they make a counter offer that's better, you need to walk away and say that was a good deal for me.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's been fascinating. So the question now, of course, is we've got a lot of listeners who are listening to these important skills that one has to develop. How do you go about developing these skills now? How do we help people become better negotiators?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things I can recommend. You can take a negotiation course. As long as you practice what you learn there. I still do negotiation courses, and I think the problem with just doing a course is people tend to say that was fantastic. They high five, you get great reviews, and then they don't practice it, or they go back to their old habits, as I say. So what I would recommend is better than that is A, reading a book like Getting to Yes, and B, getting a negotiation coach. It's somebody to guide you through the first one or two serious negotiations that you do, sort of on-the-job training. So that's where you will learn these skills. So, and that's a better way of embedding them. But a more simple way is just, if you want to know some more, just leave some comments on the podcast as to what else you would like to know, because, of course, there's a ton of stuff. I don't necessarily want to do 1 million podcasts on this unless there's a demand, and I'm telling you, what we've covered now are the basics that any negotiator should know. And then, if your job is negotiation, you probably need to know a bit more. But you probably need to know a lot more. And we can, depending on, the kind of interest we get, questions asked. Yeah, and please don't hesitate to ask a question. We will deal with all questions that are asked on the website, so don't be afraid.
I mean, just listening to you anecdotally, I can say to myself, I think that being coached in how to handle negotiation, you would get your money back in no time flat. I've just sold a piece of ground in the wilderness that has cost us an arm and a leg. And I mean, I'm crazy knowing you so well. The first thing I should have done was said, we've got an offer on this piece of ground. What do I do, Derek? Because I've taken a huge bath and my principal.
Yeah, well, as I said, the offer is open.
Thank you. Great. Derek, that was absolutely excellent.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for stepping in. And for listeners, as I said, if you want to ask a question, pop a note on our website, which is www.not-business-.com. That's not just business.com with hyphens. And we'll see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.